Hi everyone. I'm Helen from Susan's family. Today, I'm bringing you a Fenghua vest. It consists of the hem, the main part, the collar, and the sleeve cuffs. The main part includes the body, the front panel, the back panel, and the shoulder parts. We start by knitting the hem from the bottom upwards. Then, we continue upwards to knit the main part. After completing it, we pick up stitches round the neckline to knit the collar. Finally, we pick up stitches around the cuffs to knit the sleeve cuffs. This vest comes in 2 lengths. The making method is the same, but the shorter version has fewer rounds for the body compared to the regular length. Let's start by learning how to knit the hem. We use a method of alternating 1 purl stitch and 1 knit stitch for the beginning chain. Then, we knit in the round using a 2x2 ribbing pattern. That means alternating 2 purl stitches with 2 knit stitches to create the texture. First, let's familiarize ourselves with the chart. The chart is provided for teaching purposes only. Please refer to your actual project for accuracy. The chart is laid out in a grid format, where each square represents 1 stitch, corresponding to 1 loop in your knit. These blank areas indicate spaces. Some areas are omitted, while others represent gaps formed by decreasing stitches. When counting the number of stitches per row or round, count the number of squares. Then, match this to the number of loops on your knitting needles. The numbers on the side of the chart indicate the row numbers. Arrows show the direction of the knitting. The row numbers on the right side of the chart indicate where you work on the right side. The chart is read from right to left. In later sections, the row numbers will be marked on the left side. The row numbers on the left side of the chart indicate where you work on the wrong side. The chart is read from left to right when working on the wrong side. When working on the wrong side, you need to use the opposite stitch. The stitch techniques used in the knitting are indicated on the chart. I won't go through each one in detail here. Now, please watch me demonstrate the specific knitting method. To make it easier to view, I will use a single strand of cotton yarn for the rest of the tutorial, and the colors will be random. For specific yarn, color schemes, and hook sizes, please refer to the detail page of our product and the paper instructions. First, we'll start with the foundation chain, and then work the 2x2 ribbing pattern. After the foundation chain, knit 1 row, then continue working in the round. The video primarily demonstrates the method. For the specific stitch count and number of rounds, please refer to the chart. You can also learn the technique first, and then proceed with the knitting. Please watch the demonstration. Start with 1 purl stitch, then alternate with 1 knit stitch for the foundation chain. Make a slip knot with the yarn. Leave a slightly longer yarn tail to make it easier to weave in the ends at the end. Hold the corresponding circular needle in your left hand. A circular needle looks like this, with 2 needle tips connected by a cable. You can use one of the needle tips to knit directly. Insert the hook into the loop. Slightly tighten. This is the first stitch. This stitch will be a purl stitch. Hold the other needle tip in your right hand with a pencil grip. Then take the end of the yarn around your little finger. Gently pinch the yarn with your ring finger and middle finger. Place the yarn between your index finger and middle finger. This is the basic posture for knitting with straight needles. Next, place the right needle above the yarn. Insert it downwards into the loop on the left needle. Use your right index finger to bring the yarn over. Pick up the yarn. Slip it onto the left needle. Don't pull the yarn too tight, otherwise, it will be difficult to pick up the stitches later. This is the second stitch. This stitch will be a knit stitch. You can see that the yarn is below. Start the beginning stitch for the purl row. Place the right needle underneath the yarn. Insert it from below upwards through the middle of these two loops. Pay attention to the middle position of the loops. Do not pass through the loops. Yarn over. Pick up the yarn. Slip it onto the left needle. This is the third stitch. This stitch will be a purl stitch. You can see that the yarn is above. Next, start the knit stitch. Place the right needle above the yarn. Insert the needle. Yarn over. Pick up the yarn. This is the fourth stitch. Now, start the purl stitch. Place the right needle underneath the yarn. Insert the needle. Yarn over. Pick up the yarn. This is the fifth stitch. The starting point is to alternate between one purl stitch and one knit stitch, one purl stitch, one knit stitch, and continue alternating downwards. If the yarn tail is above, start with a knit stitch. If the yarn tail is below, start with a purl stitch. Continue knitting until you reach the desired number of stitches. After casting on the required number of stitches, the cast on is complete. In my small sample, the number of stitches is fewer. When the actual number of cast on stitches is larger, please pay attention to checking the number of stitches. Next, work row 1. The first stitch in the pattern chart is a knit symbol, which corresponds to knitting a knit stitch. The yarn is below the needle. Insert the right needle from top to bottom. Insert the right needle into the first loop on the left needle. Pay attention to inserting into the loop, not between the loops. Then, with your right hand, bring the yarn around. Yarn over. Pick up the yarn. Release the loop on the left needle. That completes one knit stitch. After finishing, you will see a braid-like texture below. This is the texture of a knit stitch. Continue downward. The second stitch is still a knit symbol, corresponding to knitting one knit stitch. At this point, the loop is at the back, which is the purl loop. There is also a strand of yarn across the top of the current loop. The next loop is at the front. This is the knit loop. So we need to swap the positions of these two loops. Use your right hand to pinch the bottom of the two loops on the left needle. Then release these two loops from the left needle. First, insert the purl loop from the back onto the left needle. Next, insert the knit loop from the front onto the left needle. Now the two loops have swapped positions. Here, the knit loop is in the front. After completing, knit one stitch. Insert. Yarn over and draw through. Release the loop. Complete the knit stitch. The next two symbols are for purl stitches. Correspondingly, you will purl 2 stitches. Here, you have 2 consecutive purl stitch loops. You can knit them directly. Bring the yarn to the top of the needle. Insert the right needle from the bottom up into the loop on the left needle. Yarn over. Pick up. Release the loop from the left needle. Complete 1 purl stitch. A texture where a strand of yarn lies across the top of the loop is the purl stitch texture. Continue. Keep the yarn on top of the needle. Insert into the loop. Yarn over and draw through. Release the loop. Another purl stitch is done. The next two symbols are for knit stitches. Start with a regular knit stitch. Pay attention when switching from a purl stitch to a knit stitch. The yarn should be brought down. Match the knitting. After completing, swap the positions of the next 2 loops. The knit stitch loop should be in front. You can use a straight needle to help with the swap. First, move the 2 loops to the right needle. Then, pick up the first loop with the left needle from behind. Release the loop. Pick up the second loop with the right needle. Move them to the left needle. The loops are now swapped. Then knit 1 stitch. Follow with 2 purl stitches. Continue with 2 knit stitches. 2 purl stitches, alternating. During the knitting process, pay attention to swapping the positions of the knit and purl loops. Ensure you knit into the knit stitch loops. And purl into the purl stitch loops. Repeat this process. Finish the remaining stitches. Complete the last stitch. Pull the starting tail of the yarn slightly tight. Now the first row is done. This row is the right side of the piece. The starting tail of the yarn is on the left side. Next, start working in the round. That means starting the second round. Pick up the position of the first stitch from the previous row. Follow the pattern chart for the knitting. Start with 2 knit stitches. Work 2 knit stitches. Make the first stitch a bit tighter. The next symbol is for purl stitches. Correspondingly, work purl stitches. Besides following the pattern chart, you can also match the texture to work the stitches. When you encounter a knit texture, work a knit stitch. When you encounter a purl texture, correspondingly, work a purl stitch. This round still alternates between 2 knit stitches and 2 purl stitches. Continue to finish this round. Finish the last 2 purl stitches. Now you're at the position of the starting chain yarn tail. This indicates that 1 round is complete. You can also use a stitch marker to mark the beginning and end of each round. Simply place it between 2 loops. When you reach the stitch before the marker, it indicates that 1 round is complete. If you don't have a stitch marker, you can use a safety pin or paper clip to mark the first loop. At this point, the second round is complete. Follow the method used in the second round. To continue knitting the 2x2 ribbing pattern, start by moving the marker to the right needle. And then continue knitting. Pay attention to making the beginning and ending connection a bit tighter. This is the method for alternating between knit and purl stitches to create a 2x2 ribbing in the round. Now we've finished explaining how to knit the hem. Next, we'll move on to knitting the main part. First, we'll knit the body. Continue working in the round. You will need to use 2 different yarns. Alternate them according to the pattern repeat. Please watch the demonstration. First, work row 1. Here, I'll continue demonstrating with a small sample. We start switching yarns in this row. For convenience, I'll refer to the yarn used for the hem as color 1. And the new yarn as color 2. Here, we start decreasing by 1 stitch. Work a K2 tog, left upper 2 stitches together. Insert the right needle as if to knit. And at the same time, pick up 2 loops from the left needle. Then, pick up color 2. Leave a long tail. Hold the yarn with your right hand. Then, yarn over and draw through. Release the 2 loops from the left needle. At this point, you have completed the K2 tog, left upper 2 stitches together. You have also completed the color change. Leave a long tail of color 1 and cut the yarn. Then, tie a knot with the 2 short tails to secure them. For now, leave the tails unworked. After completing the entire piece, you can weave in all the tails. Use color 2 next. Knit 1 by 1 accordingly. Complete this round. Finish the last stitch. The first round is done. Move on to the second round. This round is all knit stitches. Everyone complete this round. After that, start the third round. Begin with 1 yarn over stitch. Then knit SPO, right upper 2 stitches together. First, slip the first stitch on the left needle, without knitting. Then knit 1 stitch. Next, pick up the slipped stitch from the previous step. Pass it over the knitted stitch, and off the left needle. This completes the SPO, right upper 2 stitches together. Continue with 2 more SPO stitches. One stitch. Two stitches. Next, knit 3 SSK, left upper 2 stitches together. One stitch. Two stitches. Three stitches. Then knit 1 yarn over stitch. 1 knit stitch. Alternate between 1 yarn over stitch and 1 knit stitch. Do this 4 times. 1 time. 2 times. 3 times. 4 times. After completing this, from the first stitch up to this point, it forms one pattern group. The rest is just repeating this pattern group. I'll demonstrate it again. First, knit 1 yarn over stitch, then knit 3 SPO, right upper 2 stitches together. Next, knit 3 SSK, left upper 2 stitches together. Then alternate between 1 yarn over stitch and 1 knit stitch. Knit 5 times. This completes another pattern group. Continue knitting the pattern groups. You can also refer to the chart for specific stitch techniques. After completing the last pattern group, the third round is done. Next, start the fourth round. This round consists entirely of knit stitches. When you encounter a yarn over loop, pick up this loop and knit it directly. Continue picking up loops and knitting normally. Finish this round. After completing the last stitch, the fourth round is done. For the following 5th to 8th rounds, knit using the same method as the first 2 rounds. You can also refer to the chart for specifics. Complete these rounds. After finishing, start the 9th round. Here, switch to color 1 for knitting. If you don't want to join and break the yarn frequently, and you will need color 2 again after 4 rounds, you can keep the yarn connected. Tie a knot on color 2 and join color 1. Then knit 1 round with color 1 using knit stitches. After completing the last stitch, the 9th round is done. Next, start the 10th round. Continue using color 1. Here, knit 1 round with purl stitches. Match the knitting. After completing the last stitch, the 10th round is done. For the next 11th and 12th rounds, continue using color 1 to knit 1 round with knit stitches, then 1 round with purl stitches. Everyone should complete this. After finishing, you will have completed 1 full pattern repeat. Here, you can refer to the chart to match it. The dimension of 1 pattern repeat. If the dimensions differ significantly, it is recommended to adjust your tension, or change the needle size and re-knit. Now we are at the 13th round. Here, you need to use color 2 for knitting. Color 1 will be used again after a few rounds. Since the interval is quite large, if you want a more aesthetically pleasing result, you can leave a long tail and cut the yarn. When you reach the corresponding position, reattach the yarn and continue knitting. Alternatively, you can keep the yarn tail. For the following rounds, simply pull the yarn and knit. Pull color 2 up, and then start knitting directly. Make sure the length of the pulled yarn is about the same as the height of the fabric piece. Keep the fabric flat. Start with 1 round of knit stitches. Place color 1 on the wrong side. After finishing the last stitch, round 13 is completed. The remaining rounds do not involve any new stitch techniques or methods. Just follow the chart for knitting. Pay attention that the number of rounds for the short version and the regular version are different. The chart marks the position where the body of each style ends. Don't knit the wrong number of rounds. If you run out of yarn during the knitting process and need to join yarn, use the method of switching from color 2 to color 1. Tie a knot with the previous yarn tail. If you switch colors by pulling the yarn directly, make sure the pulled yarn is level with the fabric. Ensure the final fabric remains flat. That concludes the explanation of the body section. Next, we'll knit the chest pieces. Here, we will knit the front and back chest pieces separately. Start with the front chest piece. Continue with the working yarn from the body. Knit back and forth. During this process, you need to bind off at the underarm position. Please watch the demonstration. Here, I will continue using the small sample for the demonstration. First, remove the stitch marker that marks the beginning. Work row 1. Begin by binding off a few stitches. Here, we use the tuck stitch method to bind off. Bind off while knitting. This row is still worked with color 2. Let's start by binding off. Refer to the pattern chart for the specific number of stitches. For my small sample, I will bind off 5 stitches. One stitch, 2 stitches, 3 stitches, 4 stitches, 5 stitches. Continue knitting according to the pattern chart. The loops on the right needle are the first stitch on the left side of the pattern after binding off. That is, the first square on the left side of the bind off in the pattern. Then start knitting from the second square. Keep knitting down to just before the next bind off position in the pattern. When you reach the corresponding position, from here onward, is the back panel area. Do not knit for now. At this point, the first row of the front panel is completed. Next, knit the second row. Turn. We will work this row on the wrong side. You need to knit the opposite stitch pattern as shown in the chart. Start by binding off again. When binding off on the right side, you will be binding off while knitting the stitches. When working on the wrong side, you will be binding off while purling the stitches. Similarly, I bind off 5 stitches in my sample. Refer to the chart for the exact number of stitches. One stitch. 2 stitches. 3 stitches. 4 stitches. 5 stitches. The loops on the needle are the 1 stitch on the left side after binding off. Continue knitting according to the chart. The symbols in the chart that follow are all knit stitches. The opposite stitch corresponds to purling. Finish this row. When you encounter a suspended loop, pick up the corresponding single thread and continue knitting. After completing the last loop, move down to the previous bind off position. At this point, the second row is done. Next, work row 3. Work this row on the right side. Simply knit the stitches according to the chart. This row requires using color 1. If there was a yarn tail left from before, you can pull the yarn over and continue knitting. If no yarn tail was left, then join a new yarn and continue knitting. Here, I'll demonstrate joining a new yarn. As you work down, refer to the chart and bind off as you go. I will bind off 3 stitches in my sample. Refer to the chart for specifics. After completing it, continue to follow the chart for the next rows. The first stitch on the right needle is the first stitch after binding off. Continue from the second stitch downwards. Finish the last stitch. Row 3 is now completed. Move on to row 4. Work this row on the wrong side. The method is similar to row 2. Refer to the chart and bind off as you go. Continue to follow the chart and work the opposite stitch. This row has purl stitch symbols. Work the opposite stitch, which is knit. Match the stitches accordingly. Finish the last stitch. Row 4 is now complete. For rows 5 and 6, follow the same method as the first 2 rows. Pay attention to the number of stitches to bind off referring to the chart. After completing it, move on to row 7. You need to switch to color 2 for knitting. Here, you can simply pull up color 2 and start knitting. Alternatively, you can leave a long tail and cut color 2. Then rejoin the yarn and continue knitting. Finish the last stitch. Row 7 is now complete. For the remaining rows, no new stitch techniques or methods are used. Just refer to the chart for knitting. At this point, the front panel section is explained. The front panel section is now completed. Next, we will knit the front shoulder parts. Here, it is divided into left and right shoulder parts. We will knit them separately. First, continue with the previous yarn to knit one side of the shoulder part. After completing it, rejoin the yarn and knit the other side of the shoulder part. Start by knitting the left shoulder part. The left and right sides are determined based on how the garment will be worn. Continue with the yarn tail from the chest panel. Knit back and forth. On the side near the neckline, you need to bind off. Use the tuck stitch method for binding off. The edge side does not require binding off. For the last few rows, use short rows to form the sloping shoulder. Pay attention to switching colors during this process. The method for binding off here is the same as the one used for binding off under the arm. However, at the neckline, you will bind off at the beginning of the wrong side rows. Refer to the chart. Keep knitting until you reach the position for the short rows. That is, before the 5th to last row. Here, I'm demonstrating with a small swatch. When you reach the corresponding position, start from the 5th to last row and begin the short rows. We will work this row on the wrong side. At the beginning, refer to the chart for binding off. Then continue knitting the corresponding stitch pattern. Keep knitting until you have 5 stitches left at the end. When you reach the corresponding position, leave the remaining stitches unworked. At this point, the 5th to last row is completed. Continue with the 4th to last row. Turn. Start by working a slip stitch with a knot. Place the yarn above the right hand needle. Then, from below, pick up the first stitch on the left hand needle without working it. Pull the yarn tight to the back. At this point, the first stitch forms a slip stitch with a knot. This is a slip stitch with a knot. To make it easier to find the position later, we will place a stitch marker on this stitch. Then continue with the regular stitch pattern. Work until the last stitch. The fourth to last row is now completed. Next, work the third to last row. Start by following the chart to fasten off. Keep working until you have 5 stitches left from the previous row. That is, 4 stitches before the marked position. Including the stitch with the marker. That makes a total of 5 stitches. When you reach the corresponding position, the third to last row is now complete. Next, work the second to last row. Start with a slip stitch with a knot. Then place a marker. After that, you need to switch colors. Then follow the chart to correspondingly knit. Work until the last stitch. The second to last row is now completed. Next, work the final row. This row requires you to eliminate the row. That means picking up all the loops on the straight needle and knitting them. This will eliminate the position of the short rows. First, refer to the chart and knit. When you reach the marked position, here you will do a slip stitch with a knot. Pick up the 2 loops corresponding to this stitch, and knit them together using the appropriate stitch technique. Continue knitting after that. When you encounter a slip stitch with a knot, pick up the 2 strands together and knit them. Continue knitting the rest. Finish the last stitch. At this point, the final row is complete. Proceed to bind off. To make it easier to find the position later, you can use a different color of yarn or another type of yarn to bind off. Take a long tail. Thread the needle. Slip each loop off. Tie a knot with the yarn tail. Finally, leave a long tail and cut the yarn. Here, I'll demonstrate weaving in the ends. All the yarn tails should be woven into the wrong side of the fabric. For the yarn tails that were not tied earlier, tie a knot with a nearby stitch first, then weave it in following the texture. You can weave in a few more stitches. Try to weave in the ends within the same type of yarn area. For the yarn tails that were already tied, you can directly weave them into the fabric. Now, the left shoulder part has been explained. Next, we will knit the right shoulder part. Start by joining the yarn and binding off. Here, use color 2. To begin, for a secure start, you can make a slip knot. Continue knitting while binding off. Refer to the chart to bind off the required number of stitches. Continue following the chart to knit. Start from the second square of the chart. The yarn loop on the right needle is the first loop of the first square. The method for knitting the right shoulder part is similar to the left shoulder part. Bind off the stitches near the neckline. That means binding off on the right side. On the other side, work even. When you reach the last few rows, you need to work short rows. After finishing, fasten off. Everyone, refer to the chart to complete the remaining part. Now, the front shoulder part has been explained. Next, we will knit the back chest piece and the shoulder parts. Simply pick up the remaining loops and start knitting. Begin by joining the yarn. Then, work back and forth. The sides of the chest piece also need to be bound off. At the shoulder parts, bind off and work short rows. After finishing one shoulder part, join and bind off with the front shoulder part. Then, rejoin the yarn and knit the other shoulder part. Finally, join and bind off with the front shoulder part. The method for knitting the pattern has been demonstrated and explained earlier. Now, let's move on to the method for joining and binding off at the end. This video primarily demonstrates the method. For specific stitch counts, refer to the chart. Similarly, you can learn this first, and then proceed with the knitting. Please watch the demonstration. I'll demonstrate how to transfer the loops that are about to be bound off back onto a straight needle. Here, I'm using a straight needle. First, thread through the loops one by one. After threading, check the stitch count. If everything is correct, cut the yarn and pull out the needle. Then, join and bind off the stitches. The first method is to connect stitch to stitch. This method is commonly used when both pieces are in loop form. It's a frequently used joining method. You join the pieces by binding off the loops together. This is typically used to connect the shoulders of the front and back pieces. Both pieces are in loop form. We will consider the garter stitch side as the right side. The joining and binding off are usually done on the wrong side of the piece. This means you need to place the two pieces with their right sides facing each other. Typically, one of the pieces remains uncut. Regardless of which piece the working yarn is on. Place the side with the yarn tail on the right. When binding off, you generally knit and bind off at the same time. This means passing through the loops of both pieces simultaneously. Knit and bind off by tucking in the stitches. Simply work into each stitch and bind off as you go. If one of the pieces has more stitches, you need to decrease while binding off on the side with more stitches. For example, if this piece has more stitches, you can insert the hook into 2 loops at once. Then continue by inserting the hook into 1 loop. Knit and bind off. If the other piece has more stitches, insert the hook into 2 loops at once on that side. Knit and bind off. Here, the 2 pieces have the same number of stitches. Continue binding them off. Tie off the yarn tail and hide it. This is the effect after binding off and joining the pieces. This is the final result. Now we have finished explaining the back chest piece and the shoulder parts. We have also completed the main part. Next, we will knit the collar. Pick up stitches along the neckline. Then, work in the round with 2 times 2 ribbing. After finishing, bind off with single ribbing. The method for this pattern is the same as the one used for the hem. However, here you need to use 4 straight needles to work in the round. Let me demonstrate the method for picking up stitches for the first round. The technique for working 2 times 2 ribbing with 4 straight needles. And the method for binding off at the end. Pay attention when picking up stitches and encountering the marked lines. You can pick them up together, wrap them in as you knit. Everyone can learn this first. And then refer to the pattern chart for knitting. Please watch the demonstration. Start by picking up and knitting the first round. I'll demonstrate using this small sample. We start picking up stitches from the back piece. You can see that the back piece is usually divided into 3 sections, the 2 side edges and the middle part. Before picking up, you can first follow the requirements on the diagram to divide the total number of stitches to be picked up on the back piece. Among these 3 sections, usually, the middle section is picked up stitch by stitch. The remaining stitches are evenly distributed between the 2 side edges. For example, if I need to pick up 21 stitches in total on this back piece, I will pick up 11 stitches one by one in the middle. These 11 stitches are typically the number of stitches used for tucking in the middle. The remaining stitches can be evenly picked up as 5 stitches on each side. For this round of picking up stitches, knit all the stitches. For such side edges, pick up a few strands along the edge. Make sure to keep them roughly even. Here, I'm using different colors of yarn to demonstrate, making it easier to watch. After picking up the stitches on the sides, in the middle, pick up 11 stitches one by one. After completing, for this side, continue to pick up 5 stitches evenly. After completing, move to the front piece position. Distribute the total number of picked up stitches on the front piece equally among these 3 sections. For example, if I need to pick up a total of 39 stitches on this front piece, I decreased 7 stitches in the middle, so I pick up 16 stitches on each side. Just distribute them roughly evenly. After picking up all the stitches, check the number of stitches, then distribute them evenly onto 3 knitting needles. This completes the first round of picking up stitches. Here, I'll demonstrate the method for circular knitting with 4 knitting needles using a small sample. Arrange 3 knitting needles in a triangle shape like this. Then use the 4th needle to knit. First, complete the knitting on the first needle. Tighten the yarn at the point where the needles meet. After finishing the first needle, continue with the second needle. Similarly, tighten the yarn slightly after completing the first needle. After finishing the second needle, move on to the third needle. before reaching the yarn tail position. This indicates the end of the round. Then continue knitting in circles using this method. You can identify the beginning and end of each round by the starting yarn tail. You can also mark the first stitch. This is the method for circular knitting with 4 straight needles. Now I'll demonstrate the final bind-off method for circular 2x2 ribbing using a small sample. Notice that the texture below is knit stitches. Place the needle underneath the yarn. Knit 2 purl stitches. Then bind off 1 stitch. Pay attention not to bind off too tightly. Next, use your left hand to pinch the bottom of the yarn loop on the right needle. Take the needle out. Place the needle above the yarn and insert it back into the loop. The texture on the left side is purl stitches. Work the opposite stitch pattern. Knit 1 stitch. Bind off 1 stitch. Continue to knit 1 stitch. Bind off 1 stitch. Then pinch the bottom of the loop. Remove the needle. Place the needle underneath the yarn and insert it back into the loop. Purl 1 stitch. Bind off 1 stitch. Continue to purl 1 stitch. Bind off 1 stitch. Pay attention to always move the right needle. To change the position of the yarn. When knitting, the yarn is below. When purling, the yarn is above. Follow this method for the rest. Continue binding off until the end of the round. Finally, leave a yarn tail and fasten off. Weave in the ends. That's how you bind off. Now we have finished explaining how to knit the collar. Next, knit the sleeve cuffs. Pick up stitches along the armhole. Then knit in the round using the 2x2 ribbing pattern. Finish with a single rib bind off. The technique is exactly the same as for the collar. Just note that if the front piece was knitted by pulling a thread. When picking up stitches in the first round, pick up the thread marks together. Wrap them in as you knit. Complete this step on your own. Now we have finished explaining how to knit the sleeve cuffs. Up to this point, the entire vest has been fully explained. If you have any unclear points during the knitting process, don't hesitate to reach us via our website. Susan's Family. Support your handwork experience. Enjoy the joy of life. Thank you all for watching. See you in the next episode.